This is Die Pony Die, written by Frank Kuntz and read by Rory Schneider. For the last 40 years, Leo and Frank Kuntz have been involved in helping to preserve a historically genetic and threatened type of horse, the Nokota, the horse of the Northern Plains natives. There are less than 1,000 of this type of horse alive today. This horse was a gift to the Plains natives from their creator. The horse pulled their travois. The buffalo horse was for hunting. The most prized was the war horse, the fastest and the strongest. During the mid-1800s, policy was to destroy everything when the military took a village. Homes, clothing, and food were burned, and many of their horses were shot or their throats were slit. Even after the natives were put onto reservations, the cavalry was sent in to round up the native-type horse under the premise that they were carrying disease, and they would either shoot them or send them to auction. This type of horse was in the Teddy Roosevelt National Park when it was fenced in the early 1950s. Park policy at that time was the total elimination of the horse in the park. Box Canyon-type roundups were attempted, but with little success. Hay was poisoned and fed. Local ranchers were hired to rope some, and others were shot. Fortunately, some local residents and others asked North Dakota congressional delegates in D.C. to help. The Theodore Roosevelt National Park decided to keep the horses as a historical demonstration herd. This all changed in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The park superintendent, Harvey Wickwire, made the decision to start to change the geno and phenotype of the wild horse herd. They introduced domestic studs, including quarter horse, Shire cross, and an Arabian. These horses could not compete with the wild native studs to keep and maintain their mare bands, so policy then became the removal of the native wild studs, allowing the introduced domestic studs to make an impact on the herd. They did this by using helicopters and outriders to round up the wild horses. Their first attempt in the early 1980s was a total disaster. They lost a number of horses running long distances in the heat. During subsequent roundups, the Teddy Roosevelt National Park targeted the native-type studs and lead mares. At the 1986 roundup, Leo and Frank Kuntz purchased 52 head at the wild horse auction. There, they also met Castle McLaughlin, who at the time was working as an intern with the park and who in 1987 was given a grant to research the history of the wild horses in the park, which was funded in part by a grant from the Theodore Roosevelt Nature and History Association. Dr. Castle McLaughlin is currently Associate Curator of the North American Ethnography at Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Her chronicled research showed that the wild horses in the Theodore Roosevelt National Park were descended from the Northern Plains natives and the turn-of-the-century ranch horses, with strong historical connections to Sitting Bull and his sub-chiefs, the Marquis de Morez, who was the founder of the town of Medora, North Dakota, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a rancher in western North Dakota and later became the president, and A.C. Heidecooper, who ran the largest horse ranch in the world at one time near Amadon, North Dakota. In the 1991 park roundup, the Kuntz brothers were successful at getting the national park to start blood testing their horses and to take out the introduced domestic studs. But what the park didn't tell people was that most of the Shire's crosses' offspring were left in the park. It was suggested that inbreeding could become a problem, with the response being that they knew what they were doing. Blood work was done only on horses that were being sold. The park sold 62 head of horses, and the brothers, Frank and Leo, bought 11 that were the old native type. The blood was sent to Dr. Gus Cothran at the University of Kentucky. There were 10 horses he called the Teddy Roosevelt National Park Old Line, adding that they were, quote, extremely divergent from any other domestic breed. In 2009, the Teddy Roosevelt National Park started using an experimental contraceptive drug called Gonacon, requiring a yearly injection to prevent pregnancy. They began to study the herd to see what effects the drug was having regarding social structure. This study's credibility is questionable. The Theodore Roosevelt National Park's last 40 years of management, or mismanagement as it were, has resulted in a horse herd with less genetic diversity and the changing of a historically correct geno and phenotype horse, as well as culling the younger horses, which will result in an older herd dying off of old age, especially with the continued use of the experimental drug Gonacon. In a report called The Genetic Diversity and Origin of the Feral Horses in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, published on August 1, 2018, it states, quote, "It is recommended that new genetic stock be introduced and that adaptive management principles are employed to ensure that unique mitochondrial lineages are preserved and genetic diversity is increased and maintained over time." Unquote. This is a national park. They should not be breeding into extinction a genetically, historically correct horse. There is a need for an interpretive center on the horse and the slow reintroduction of the Nokota horses back into the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Now is the time for the Theodore Roosevelt National Park to do their job, and their job is to do what is right. The park should reintroduce the type of horse that was there before the park was fenced, which is the Nokota horse. It is time to acknowledge the Northern Plains people's history, their horses, and their horse culture. The Native people's unique history and culture is a very important part of this nation's history. The Nokota horses need your help. Please contact Blake McCann, Theodore Roosevelt National Park wildlife biologist, at blake@nps.gov, and Superintendent Wendy Ross at area code 701-623-4466, and ask them to do what is right for the horses. Frank Kuntz, Executive Director and co-founder of the Nokota Horse Conservancy. Hey there guys, my name is Rory Schneider. I've been a volunteer for the Nokota Horse Conservancy since the summer of 2012 when I first started getting involved. It's a rainy day here in South Dakota on a Saturday, and so I decided to take some time this morning and this afternoon to put together a grouping of pictures to go along with an article written recently by Frank Kuntz called Die Pony Die. The content is a tiny bit abrasive just because it's just Frank's direct addressing of a situation that he's been dealing with for the better part of his adult life, trying to preserve and promote the Nokota horses of the Northern Plains. And so a lot of the pictures I grabbed were just off the internet. Some of them were personal photos, some were photos from Frank, some were from video footage that is archived on the Nokota Horse Conservancy website. But I just want to say as a basic disclaimer that first of all, this entire project is based on a letter that was written by Frank Kuntz, so the language is his own. The images were compiled by me. Many of them are copyrighted. I don't have rights to use probably half of the stuff in this short video, but I'm not trying to use it for any sort of financial gain, or it's just for personal use, and so that this information can be shared. I thought that compiling some of these images that I had access to would be a valuable addition to Frank's letter, just to provide a little more context and maybe provide some more backstory and then encourage more interest in sort of digging into the true story. So I hope you find this interesting, but like I said, it's just for supporting the Nokota horses and the cause. I'm not trying to make any money, and so that's my little disclaimer. I hope you enjoyed this. Contact me if you have comments or questions. Thanks, guys.